Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the start of Chapter 28, Physical Geography of Australia, Oceania, and Antarctica. Today's video, we are going to be talking about the physical landforms in Australia. It's going to be a fairly short video, but I found a couple of things online that I'd really like to share with you that I think will help you understand um, the physical landforms of Australia a little bit better than the textbook. So before we get started on any of those external sources, let's take a look at the textbook. And this is page 776 and 777 for those of you that keep your textbook handy. I want you to pay particular attention to that physical feature under Picture This on page 776, Catch the Wave. I just want to point this out because this is considered one of the most fascinating landforms in Australia, and unfortunately, I was not able to find too much information on it in usable websites, meaning a website that I could present here on screen. But I wanted to talk about the geology. Now, if you remember back to when we were talking about weathering and erosion, of course, weathering is where the wind and the water tend to wear down the rock, and erosion is when the wind and water carry away the resulting soil that comes from that rock. And if you look at that picture, you can kind of see it right there. This is actually a wall of granite near the town of Hyden in Australia, and weathering and erosion have acted on this wall of granite in a very peculiar way. Instead of wearing it down from the top, um, the wind and water have actually been wearing away at it from the side. And consequently, you have what's called an undercut and kind of a pipe shape. And when you look at it here in the picture, you can see that it kind of looks like a giant wave coming in from the ocean, which is how it got its name, Wave Rock. But I wanted to point that out in particular because Australia in general has some of the most fascinating physical geography of any of the continental regions or subcontinents that we've studied up to this point. And Wave Rock certainly does make for an outstanding example of what constitutes fascinating physical geography. So with that, let's look on page 777 at the landforms of Australia, and you can see it says right there, Australia is the 6th largest country in the world, but it is also its own continent. Um, now, Australia does have islands around the main island, the main continent, but those islands are part of the same continental plate. So they do count as part of the Australian continent. Says it's got low relief. There are a few differences in the elevation of adjacent areas, narrow plains, very limited farmland on those narrow plains running along the southern and southeastern portions of Australia. They do talk about two major rivers. Now we're going to take a look at a couple of other rivers here throughout the video. The two major rivers they talk about are the Murray and the Darling, and both of these rivers exist in the southern or southeastern part of the continent and drain through those plains. There are a number of other fairly sizable rivers in Australia that we'll see that actually are up on the outback, which is the Central Plateau, um, running across most of the continent of Australia. The chain of mountains known as the Great Dividing Range. We will take a look at that. It is a continental divide, but at the same time, it is not a true mountain range. The Great Dividing Range is actually an escarpment, and we'll talk about how the higher plains in the center part of Australia come to the edge, and yes, there is an up and down ripple at that escarpment before the Great Dividing Range drops off to the coastal plains. And you will hear me refer to a mountain range called the Blue Mountains, which are part of the Great Dividing Range. The book talks about the outback, the vast area of plains and plateaus, largely flat and dry. There are several films that you may or may not have ever seen where the outback features prominently in the storyline. If you happen to see um, the film about Walt Disney producing Mary Poppins, I think it's called Saving Mr. Banks. The early part of the story where the author of the Mary Poppins books was growing up in Australia actually takes place in the outback. Um, there's a Western movie that's called Quigley Down Under that also takes place in the outback. And you can see that the outback bears a very similar resemblance to the southwestern United States as far as the desert conditions and the number of rocky outcroppings that show up out there. But for the most part, it's rolling terrain across the top of the Central Plateau. We will take a look at some of the isolated rock formations that have had most of the loose soil eroded away from around them, including Ayers Rock, which no longer goes by that name. Actually, it goes by its Aborigine name, Uluru. And of course, nobody can talk about the landforms of Australia without talking about the Great Barrier Reef off the Gold Coast in northeastern Australia, and we will take a look at that as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see what I am looking at on my laptop. So when we first look at the continent of Australia, you can see that much like the United States and Canada, it is divided up into a number of different states. You can see out here, Western Australia makes up pretty much the western third of the continent. And it includes, you can see here, the Kimberley Plateau, the Great Sandy Desert, the Gibson Desert, the Great Victoria Desert, named after Queen Victoria of England, the Nullarbor Plain down here in the south, and this is much of the plains that the textbook talks about. Up here in the north central, you have the Northern Territory. A lot of the outback falls into this area straddling the Northern Territory and Western Australia. And you can see that the host of rivers along the coast here in Western Australia and along the northern coast of the Northern Territory, most of them do not come out into the outback region. So it's easy to see how the outback maintains its arid conditions. South Australia, here in the South Central, includes the largest lake in Australia. That would be Lake Eyre. We'll look at that a little bit closer here in a little bit. And it is a saltwater lake, which we'll talk about as well. New South Wales, down here in the Southeast Territory, is probably the part of Australia that most people are familiar with because it is home to Sydney, Australia. And while Sydney is not the capital of Australia, it is one of the largest cities, and it is very famous from a historical point of view. Quite a bit of when England actually owned Australia, quite a bit of English military history occurred here in New South Wales. Canberra here is actually the capital, also in New South Wales. Victoria, home of Melbourne, which I believe is the 5th largest city in Australia. Um, it is a small state, and most of your coastal plains are going to fall in the state of Victoria or along the southern edge of South Australia here. Up here in the northeast, you actually have Queensland and Townsville. I've actually been into Townsville. It's a beautiful little town. You can see quite a few rivers running through Queensland and running through New South Wales here, with a major river running through Victoria. Um, but what makes Queensland so famous is if you look off the coast here, you can see the mark for the Great Barrier Reef. And this part of Australia, in Queensland and just touching the very top of New South Wales, is known as the Gold Coast. Um, not necessarily because of the amount of gold that's found there, although that does play into it a little bit, but because of the paradise-like conditions. You can see the um, tropic lines right here, Tropic of Capricorn, running across the center of Australia. So most of Queensland falls into the tropics, and the Great Barrier Reef is actually some of the most beautiful underwater sites. It's very popular with snorkelers and scuba divers. It's also very popular with fishermen. And if you ever want to check out some great white sharks, this is one of the two best places on the planet to get a good up close look at sharks, because the area between the Great Barrier Reef and the Gold Coast itself um, is prolific, um, as the sharks use it as a hunting ground. Down here, the Big Island of Tasmania is its own state. It is detached from the main body of Australia, but it is still part of the same continental plate. So that's pretty much looking at the physical structure of um, Australia. And you can get a little better look at how the states fall out here. You can see Queensland being one of the largest, Western Australia being the largest state, um, and kind of get an idea there of what the state lines look like. So let's take a look at some of the landforms. This is mostly cities labeled on this map, but I do want to point out right here, Uluru, formerly known as Ayers Rock. Uluru is, we'll take a look at that close up later on. It is a large mesa, essentially, sticking up out of the outback, and it is considered a sacred site by the Aborigine people in Australia. The country of Australia has actually designated that as a historical site. But the other reason I wanted you to see this map is because you can see the blue where the rivers are. And yes, there's a couple here in Western Australia. Um, the major ones that your book talks about are down here between New South Wales and Lake Victoria. But look at the cluster of rivers running all through Queensland and the northern part of New South Wales here. Very, very wet territory in this part of Australia, in the northeast and eastern corner. And then slightly fewer rivers up on the edge of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. This is where your outback sits, and this is where the bulk of the desert is. But we only see the rivers coming into the central part of Australia here in the northeast and eastern corner. If you look at the relief map of Australia here, you can see the green, which of course is lower elevation, and a more wet environment. Um, In this area right here, where Lake Ayers sits, these are the coastal plains that the textbook talks about here. You've got some coastal plains that the textbook does not address up here in the northern areas. But you can see this is the mountain range, the Great Dividing Range, and the Blue Mountains, which actually are this part of the Great Dividing Range here in the southeast corner, just west of Sydney. But that Great Dividing Range runs pretty much the entire stretch north to south of Australia, and it actually disappears into the ocean here in the Coral Sea and comes back up in Papua New Guinea, just off the map here. When you look west of that range, you only have that one significant area right here um, that gets any kind of significant moisture. The outback, and this is the rise of the plateau is in this area here, but the outback constitutes the bulk of the western half of Australia. And this area here, again, it's rolling terrain with large stands of rocks that have been left behind by weathering and erosion, but it's very, very dry, takes up quite a bit of space. So I'm going to take a look at, this is a PowerPoint presentation that deals with there we go, top 10 Australian landforms. So let's take a look at the top 10 Australian landforms here. I'm going to skip a few slides simply because they explain stuff that we've already studied as far as the definition of a landform. But one of the things that this slideshow does do differently is that it identifies a landmark as well as a landform. So in the case of Australia, when we're looking at that, a landmark can refer to a landform such as Uluru in Central Australia, but a landmark can also address notable locations or major events. So I said Sydney was famous for several reasons, and this right here in the lower left corner of the slide is one of them. That is the Sydney Opera House, which is a huge open air um, opera hall. They do opera there. They do symphony orchestras there. They do shows on television and cable from that location. New Year's Eve, because Australia is one of the first countries to celebrate the new year. You can see New Year's Eve celebration coming from here. Actually, starting well into the morning of New Year's Eve, our time. But when this place is full of people and it's lit up, it is absolutely fascinating to see. And you can see the scallop shell structure here, which actually allows for sound projection to extend a great distance. So even though the Opera House sits out in this little peninsula in the Sydney Harbor, one of the cool things about it is you can be across the harbor over here in the main part of the city, and you can still very clearly hear everything going on inside the Opera House because the way the shell structure of the Opera House projects the sound. Now, that being said, because we're dealing with geography, we're dealing more with landforms than landmarks. But I did want to point out the Opera House just because I find it fascinating. So let's look at some of the landforms that are considered in the top 10 things to visit here in Australia. This is Nitmiluk National Park in the Northern Territory. And the Catherine River is the water that you see flowing through the center there. The Catherine is not a large river. It's not really navigable, but there are patches of it that are available for fishing. Certainly, it does flow into the Daly River in the town of Catherine in the Northern Territory, and the Daly River is one of the major rivers in Australia. Um, but you can see here on the slide that what makes Nitmiluk National Park so fascinating is this is a gorge. And you've got some standing water, you've got a meandering river, the Catherine River, flowing through this area. Um, and the Catherine has created these gorges by, of course, eroding the the rock along which it flowed and created these gorges. There are 13 separate gorges of absolutely immense size that run through the national park here that the Catherine River has created, and not only is it considered beautiful for sightseeing, but also for people who particularly enjoy hiking and uh, and camping activities as well. It's absolutely beautiful territory. This is a landform that exists just off the coast of Victoria. If you remember, Victoria is in the southeastern corner of Australia. And so standing here looking this way, we're looking west. And there used to be 12 of them, which is why they're referred to as the 12 apostles. But these are limestone columns. And you have the limestone cliffs along this escarpment here um, at the end of the Great Dividing Range. The ocean, in large part, has caused the weathering and erosion of the materials around this limestone, and it eroded away um, all of the more broken rock in this area and left these limestone columns uh, just standing up. So there's only 8 of them left, um, and I have no idea when the other limestone columns eventually crumpled and went away, but um, eventually these will all be gone because the weathering and erosion continues to work against the limestone, which, if you remember from South Asia, limestone is a fairly soft sedimentary rock. It's made from the shells of dead sea animals, but eventually those will be eroded away as well. This is part of the Australian outback, and as you remember, we were talking about the Australian outback um, being mostly flat, rolling terrain, but with some um, rocky outcroppings. And you can see here um, the rolling terrain, kind of reminiscent of areas of central Missouri or eastern Kansas before you start getting out into the flattest parts of Kansas, kind of like Iowa maybe. You will see rolling terrain like this throughout the outback, and you will occasionally see this is not a mountain range. This is actually just an outcropping of about a half a dozen rocky uh, uh, hills um, that exist out on the edge of this particular territory. These are called the Flinders Range. And you can see simply by the vegetation, the trees are short and scrubby. Um, there's not a lot of green in them. Most of them are plants that have adapted to the dry conditions. Uh, very little ground cover. Very, very similar to what we would see here in the United States in southern Arizona and New Mexico. Horizontal falls, so named, because again, um, the rivers that run through here um, have eroded, weathered away, and eroded um, the areas between these rocky outcroppings. And what ends up happening is in a typical waterfall, you have the water coming across slightly sloping land, and it gets to a drop off, and the water becomes a vertical waterfall. It falls over the cliff and hits the waterbed down below and continues on as a river. In this case, what has happened is these bodies of water have eroded a very narrow channel between these rocky outcroppings. So what happens is instead of getting that rush of water over the cliff and down, what you get is you get a rush of water as the water comes up to this very narrow outlet, and it pushes through the outlet. As it's pushing this large amount of water through this very narrow space, the water speeds up and becomes much rougher. And you can see as the water starts up here at the top of the slide and it pushes through this outcropping, it's coming through at a high enough speed to cause foaming and water turbulence. And so they refer to it as the horizontal falls, because instead of the water falling over a cliff, it's the water being shoved through a very narrow channel at very high speeds. Number 6, you heard me talk about the Blue Mountains. This is down in New South Wales to the west of Sydney, and it is part of the Great Dividing Range. And it's hard to see in this photo, but one of the reasons they call it, well, the reason they call it the Blue Mountains is they're not really mountains per se. They're an escarpment. If you go west of the mountain range, the drop off from the peaks is very, very low before you come out onto the Great Central Plateau. But on the east side, the drop off is incredible down to the coastal plains there in New South Wales. But the vegetation that grows along the mountain ranges, or grows along the low ends of the escarpment here, includes a great deal of eucalyptus trees. And eucalyptus trees are the trees that they tap the resins that come off the eucalyptus, and that's what they use to get the menthol that they put in things like Vicks Vapor Rub or other remedies for breathing problems. The mentholatum that they get off of that is actually a resin that when it gets really hot out, the resin will rise up onto the edges of the leaves, and they come along and they can harvest those resins. Well, what happens is that resin comes out on the leaves in the heat of the summer. The resin will actually start to evaporate, and the menthol in the resin tinges the vapor cloud blue. So on very warm days, you will actually see a blue haze hovering right at the top of the ridge. And when you're looking at it from far away, it literally looks like the mountains are blue. Now, this particular slide is talking about these 3 rocky outcroppings here called the Three Sisters. The top of the Three Sisters is about 3,000 feet above sea level. And water continues to run through the gaps between the sisters here and continues to weather and erode that area. So over the centuries, they will continue to wear away to nothing. The Daintree Rainforest, not going to talk a whole lot about it, but it is Australia's largest tropical rainforest. This thing is it's virgin, it's pristine. There's not a lot of logging going on here, not a lot of not a lot of industrial exploitation of this particular area. The country has done a fairly decent job of keeping it pristine by naming it a park. Cradle Mountain, seen here, so called because of the appearance of it being a cradle. This is Dove Lake in Tasmania. If you recall, Tasmania is the small island off the southeastern coast of Australia. And Dove Lake is one of the larger lakes in Tasmania. Um, not a whole lot to say about Cradle Mountain either. Bunga Range in Western Australia. Remember, Western Australia is pretty much the entire western half of the continent. And they say, oh, it was discovered here in 1983, and they put discovered in quotes because obviously the Aborigines living in Australia have known about this range for centuries, but the Australian government did not pay much attention to it until the last 50 years or so. So Purnululu National Park was established in 1987, and this is sandstone rock. So again, it's a sedimentary rock, and sandstone obviously exists in Western Australia because at some point in time, Western Australia would have been underwater. That's how sandstone gets created. But sandstone also being sedimentary is susceptible to weathering and erosion. And as you can see, wind and water have taken their toll here by carving this mountain range up into these little beehive-shaped clusters that make this one of the more popular sightseeing tours in Western Australia. The Great Barrier Reef is, as I said, it's several hundred miles of coral reef off the coast of Queensland and in the northeast corner of Australia. And it does extend all the way down to off the coast of New South Wales. But most of the good stuff to see on the Great Barrier Reef is farther north on that northeastern coast. And the Great Barrier Reef itself, almost continuous. Obviously, there are sections of it where there's small breaks in the reef that sailing ships over the centuries have taken advantage of in order to be able to get into shore along there. But in addition to that, there are literally hundreds of smaller reefs in between the Great Barrier Reef and the actual shoreline of mainland Australia. And Hardy Reef here, shown in this slide, is one of those smaller reefs inside the Great Barrier Reef. And Heart Reef is this little coral reef right here in the shape of a heart, which is close enough to the surface that at low tides, some of the coral is actually above water. You can see that it's shallow enough here that you can see it through the water. That's because there's only a couple of feet of water over top of it. And with this being protected by the reef from the surf, a lot of the mud that gets stirred up by wave action is not stirred up in this part of the reef here, the inland part. So the water is fairly clear. Again, very popular with snorkelers and scuba divers around in this area, and it looks kind of tiny, but I guarantee you this reef is actually fairly sizable. Last but not least, I've mentioned it a couple times. This used to be known as Ayers Rock. That was the English name given to it. The native people in Australia, the Aborigines, referred to it as Uluru. And this place is sacred to the Aborigines. There are stories that when you die, this is where your spirit goes in order to be able to get to heaven. This is actually a single rock outcropping in the middle of the outback in the Northern Territory. It's what's called a monolith, which means mono meaning one, lith meaning stone. It is the single largest monolith in the world. For about the last 50 years, this has been protected by the Australian government on behalf of the Aborigines as a national historical site, and I believe it may also show up on the world national or international uh, registry as a place of cultural significance. So those are some of the fascinating landforms that we see around Australia. Now, a couple others that I want to look at. You heard me talk about Lake Eyre, the largest lake in Australia. This is a satellite photograph of it, and you can see that it is in several different sections. This was taken during the dry season. Um, during the wet season, most of these areas that are in white are actually underwater, uh, and it is a salt lake. So when you look at these whitish areas here, those are literally salt deposits left behind when the water either drains or evaporates. And Ayers Lake is drained um, out to the south through a series of rivers that come off of its site. Um, the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales. Again, this is a satellite photo. Um, and this was also taken during the rainy season here. So what you're seeing here with the purple is actually a combination of the color of the underlying rock, which in this case I believe is sandstone, and the plant life growing on that rock, the lichens, Lichens. I believe that's on your vocabulary sheet. Snowy Mountains, also in New South Wales. Small mountain range, not much to it, but they're called the Snowy Mountains because they are actually tall enough and far enough south outside the tropical zone that the tops of the mountains have snow on them pretty much at all times. That's about all I've got for you. Obviously, if you look in the World Atlas online, there are some other really cool landforms that are out there. This particular page here is actually a geoscience page put out by the government of Australia, and it shows a number of, there's Ayers Rock, Uluru. It shows a number of interesting landforms as well. Um, you can go take a look at those snapshots. Um, you can take a look at several different versions of maps that show various landforms um, relative to the continent of Australia itself. Um, Obviously, the ones that I want you to um, focus on are the ones that are mentioned in your textbook. So you've got Wave Rock, you've got the Outback, you've got the Great Barrier Reef, and you've got the Great Dividing Mountain Range, the major rivers, the Murray and the Darling, that drain most of the southern plains. And when we come back tomorrow, we will take a look at the landforms of New Zealand and the islands of Oceania in the South Pacific. With that, I will post the link to a couple of videos describing the Australian landforms. One in particular that I think you'll enjoy deals specifically with the Great Barrier Reef and some of the life that we find in and around that reef. I think you'll really enjoy that. In the meantime, no new assignment at the end of this video, but you have been assigned your vocabulary for chapter 28, so please work on that as well. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me. You can send me a private message through Google Classroom, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have.